Hello everyone, thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Jorgen Harris. I'm an assistant professor in the economics department, and I'm going to be talking a little bit today about a piece of research I've been working on called Interactions with Powerful Female Colleagues Promote Diversity in Hiring. So the basic goal of this paper is to find out whether appellate court judges are more likely to hire female law clerks, which is essentially an entry-level apprentice position in the legal system, in years when they spend more time hearing cases and interacting with female judges, right, with peers at the top of their profession. So the reason that this is an important question is that it provides evidence to a really old, really important idea in social science called the contact hypothesis. The idea with the contact hypothesis is that we look across many different contexts where we have marginalized and advantaged groups, right? If we think about men and women in the workforce, if we think about racial marginalization, we see a combination of segregation and discrimination. So what I mean by that is if we think about gender, we see that even among workers with similar levels of education, men tend to work in higher paying occupations than women on average, right? So there's segregation across occupations. On top of this, even for workers in the same occupation, men tend to work in higher paying firms than women on average, right? So there's segregation within occupation across firms. And even within firms, men tend to have more male social networks and professional networks than women. Women tend to have more female social and professional networks than men. You combine this with men having, disproportionately making up the most powerful positions within firms, right, being more likely to be CEOs, other powerful decision makers. What you end up with is essentially an old boys club. You end up with a situation where men are more likely to work with men are more likely to preferentially hire or promote men for top positions, and as a result, we have this maintenance of a discriminatory system, right, a discriminatory equilibrium. So the contact hypothesis asks, are we likely to see less discrimination or less prejudice if members of dominant groups, right? We might think about men, we might think about white people or other advantaged racial or ethnic groups, have more sustained, more meaningful interactions with members of marginalized groups, right? When men work closely with women, are they then more likely to hire or promote or otherwise give better treatment to women in the workforce? And so the context that we care about here is looking at whether men who work closely with peers right at the top of their profession are therefore more likely to change their hiring practices at the entry level of their profession. Now, the contact hypothesis has been around for a really long time. This is an idea that goes back to the 1950s. And many sociologists, psychologists, and economists have looked for evidence of this hypothesis. But even so, we know surprisingly little about the power of intergroup contact to change people's behaviors or actions. The reason for this is that people choose their professional networks, right? So if we see that men who work more closely with female peers are also more likely to hire women at the entry level, we don't necessarily want to conclude that interacting closely with female peers changed anything about those men's practices or beliefs. It could just be that men who have more respect for women, prefer working with women, like working with women more, are both more likely to work with female peers, right, to choose to interact with female peers, and to hire women for entry-level positions. So in order to know how intergroup contact affects people's behavior, we need to look at circumstances where people don't have a choice about who they interact with, right? Essentially where people have meaningful, sustained interactions that are effectively random. So what does that look like? Well, researchers have really used two strategies to try to get at this, right? To look at situations where people are exposed to others in a random fashion. The first is doing actual experiments where researchers manipulate people's lives in order to push them into interacting with someone they wouldn't have interacted with otherwise. So a great recent example of this is a research paper where the researchers set up an amateur soccer league in a region of Iraq that's majority Christian. And they randomly selected some Christian players to be on all Christian teams, some Christian players to be on teams with some Christian and some Muslim teammates. They then saw that by the end of the season, when they invited everyone to a social event that was going to have Christians and Muslims present, the Christians who had been on mixed teams were more likely to invite their friend to this event, knowing that Muslims would be there. Now, this is a really, really powerful and useful technique, but it's also somewhat limited because there's limits to how much we're willing to manipulate people's lives, or able to manipulate people's lives. We might be able to randomly select people for an amateur soccer team. We might not be able to randomly assign people to a boss at a job, right, or other sorts of important forms of sustained contact. So the alternative is looking at what we call natural experiments, which are situations where the researcher didn't manipulate somebody's life, but some other institution in the world effectively forced someone to interact with somebody else without their interactions reflecting anything about that person's preferences or choices. So the classic example of this in the contact hypothesis work is looking at freshman year roommate assignments, right? If you're assigned a roommate effectively at random, you don't have any choice about who your roommate's going to be, then if we see that, as researchers have shown, that white students who are assigned black roommates end up with more liberal expressed views on racial issues than white students who are randomly assigned to white roommates, we can be pretty confident that contact with someone different from yourself influence people's views. Now, the limit to this, right, the limit to natural experiments has typically been that we can only really use natural experiments in contexts where people are forced to interact with someone that's not of their choosing. And the most common contexts where we can do this are situations involving college students or other young, relatively powerless people, right, who are forced to do stuff all the time. But the people whose preferences, actions, beliefs have the most impact on the world are powerful people who tend to be older and maybe have more established beliefs, right? Bosses, CEOs, managers, etc. And so it's been much, much harder to get meaningful and reliable information about how those people's professional interactions, right, meaningful interactions, influence their behavior. So what we do in this paper is look at a pretty unique setting that lets us look at the effect of sustained, meaningful professional interactions on very powerful people, federal appellate judges. So the federal appellate court is essentially the level in the US court system right below the Supreme Court. For the most part, the decisions of federal appellate courts end up being binding on the entire country. They're very, very powerful and important. The nice thing for us is that pretty much every federal appellate decision is heard by a panel of 3 judges, and those judges are randomly selected from the pool of overall judges within a circuit. So what this means is that because judges are randomly assigned to cases, judges are also randomly assigned to the colleagues with whom they hear cases. As a result, right, in some years, judges are going to hear a lot of cases with female colleagues. In other years, they're going to hear relatively few cases with female colleagues, and it's not going to have anything to do with the judge's own choices or the judge's own characteristics. On top of this, the other really nice thing about this context is that appellate judges hire law clerks pretty much every year. Most years, they make at least one hiring decision. These are really important decisions because those essentially what law clerks do is help judges decide cases and make their decisions, right? Do a lot of the legal grunt work. Law clerk positions are also an important stepping stone for important positions within the judiciary and the legal system broadly. So this is in some sense judges choosing their proteges, right? The people that they're going to mentor. As a consequence, right, this is a really unique, powerful situation where we can see important people randomly assigned to interaction with colleagues, and then observe how those random interactions influence meaningful decisions, right? Who to hire as a law clerk. So how we use this is essentially we pull data from about 50,000 published court cases from the appellate court system from a website called legal.com, a database of legal decisions, use that to determine which judges sat with which judges in each year, and then figured out, what percentage of your interactions in each year were with a female judge. We combined that with information on the staff of basically each judge's legal staff from the Judicial Yellow Book, Who's Who in Federal and State Courts, we bought from the Leadership Library, scanned in 10 years worth of PDFs, and again, turned this into a database. We use this to look at the relationship between how much more, whether a judge had above or below average number of interactions with female colleagues relative to what we'd expect for their district in that year, and whether or not the judge hired at least one female clerk in the following year. So the first thing that we're able to say, pretty confidently, is that these interactions do appear to be random. So what this is doing is essentially saying, if we look at the percentage of your co-panelists who are female, right, your interaction with female judges, are these related to your characteristics, right? Do we see, for example, that more established judges spend less time with female colleagues, which would suggest that judges have some ability to choose their colleagues? And what we see is no, that your characteristics as a judge have essentially no relationship with who you're sitting with in any particular year. The next thing we look at is whether who you sit with has an effect on your hiring decision. And here we see that the answer is yes. So what this graph is doing is essentially showing us the relationship between your interactions in a particular year and your likelihood of hiring a female clerk in following years, right, later years over here, and in early years over here. So if our strategy works, we should see, as we do, that your interactions have nothing to do with your hiring decisions before you hear cases of female judges. On the other hand, we see that in the year after you hear cases of female judges, you are significantly more likely, about 5 percentage points more likely, to hire at least one female clerk than you would be if you had a normal number of interactions with female judges. On the other hand, we see that this effect goes away pretty quickly. There's no sustained consequence of these interactions. Maybe shouldn't be so surprising given that every year you're hearing new cases, right? This isn't the first time you've ever sat with a female judge. This isn't a groundbreaking situation. It's just normal professional interaction. Okay, so I'm already out of time, so I'm going to talk very, very quickly about kind of what the implications of this are, what we can learn from this. So I think the most important lesson from this research is that this suggests that even well-established, powerful professionals are able to have their minds or their actions changed through exposure to diversity, right? And what this suggests is that if we care about broadly, diversity and opportunity in our economy, promoting diversity at the top, right, in the elite of professions, among people who have important decision-making power, can have real benefits for people at the bottom, right? Can really open up opportunities in the entry level. Not just in this context, because appointing a female judge to an important judgeship means that judge is more likely to hire female clerks, but also because interacting with more female judges is likely to lead the existing judges to hire more female clerks as well. One last thing I'm going to note is that while this context is really unusual in being able to let us estimate this effect, right, having this random interaction, these sorts of interactions that we're looking at are actually pretty typical of a wide variety of professions, right? Lots of important, highly placed people in many different professions have meaningful interactions like sitting on a panel to hear a case with their colleagues. And so we might expect that what we're finding in the judiciary is likely to hold more broadly. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for bearing with me. If you have any comments or questions, you think this is interesting, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would love to hear from you.